Lyddie Hale had leaned into silence for 3 years. Not the soft kind of quiet that settles at dusk after a day of honest labor, but the hard, edged quiet of someone who had walked the wrong side of town meetings and county courts and come home lighter in the pocket and heavier in the chest. At 38, with her hands knotted by weather and years of working with horses, she carried herself like a woman who knew how to move cattle and carry grief without tilting. She had been a wife once, and a partner in the way that only two people who start a ranch together can be partners. Hale's laugh still lived in the rafters of the barn, in the scent of alfalfa and grease. Then Silas Rourke, the land office agent with a silver tongue and a ledger full of favors, had come like wrought, inked new deeds with a smile, and left the Hales with a suit in court and a hollowed-out title. When Thomas died flattened by illness this spring after the last hearing, when hope and legal counsel were both in short supply, Lyddie did not wail. She buried him with the same careful hands that had braided a foal's mane, put a red scarf from his saddle under his collar, and came back to the house to feed the horses. The county's verdict against her had been almost ceremonial, evidence manufactured, witnesses bribed, signatures traced with a fine, practiced hand. They took acreage in the center of the valley and left a strip where Lyddie could keep the barn. 3 acres, a line of hardy mares, and a reputation that people said would be the making of someone more forgiving than she was. Forgiving had never been part of the plan. The first morning of the story was a thin ice in her voice. She woke to the same cactus sun and the same stack of bills where Thomas's hat used to sit. The land office's writs came like the post-trigular impersonal. They had threatened eviction again the week before, though they had no right to the shed behind her claim. Claim was a River Rock word now, not a home. The town turned its eyes away or said things like, "You should have taken a lawyer." And Lyddie would look at the caller and think of the ledger and the way Silas wore his power like a coat. She'd been knocked down once by grief, second by corruption, but there was a flicker in her that never quite went out. The flicker that knows the slope of a horse's shoulder before it knows the face of the man who sold the horse. She knew how to breed horses' bloodlines were language to her. Heat and temperament translated into management and numbers and patience. She could tell a mare's mood by the set of her ears and a foal's health by the way it crawled to mother's teat. She kept ledgers too, not legal ones, but stud books, one hand neater than the other. The least she could do was to raise something honest on her land, to create value she did not have to beg for. But Silas's writs threatened even that power clotted over paper, like dried blood in the bank ward with her on low-interest loans. Lyddie had real needs: feed, salt, the vet's visits, the mortgage on the truck. She had also a stubbornness that counted for something. The horses would not starve on her watch. It was on a late autumn afternoon, when the sky bruised like a fist and the wind's complaint tasted of rain, that the unfamiliar sound came, the brittle, hard cough of someone who had been shot, followed by the thud of a man too tired to hide. Lyddie found him curled against the windbreak of the lean-to behind her haystack, his coat shredded, a dark bloom on his side. He looked like trouble and like a man who had learned to keep trouble close. He had a jaw like river stone, eyes that had once been quick and had now gone slow with pain. He stared at her without surprise, as if he had expected a woman to be the one who would find him. "Don't call the sheriff," he whispered before she could think too. The word sheriff in that valley was another suit who traded favors. "Please?" The choice was no choice at all. Lyddie, who had become learned in what justice looked like when legal systems failed, recognized the shudder of someone at the mercy of a corrupt carapace. He could be an enemy, a thief, a murderer. He could also be a man who had been set upon by the same men who took her father's cattle, or the same men who had made a ledger the heart of a man's house. Her practical mind boiled it down to basics. He was alive, and if he stayed outside, he would be dead by morning. She fetched a blanket with her chin, avoiding the ache of pity that had a way of softening the practical edges of her. "You can't stay in the lean-to," she said. "You'll freeze to death and the dogs will find you." She did not ask about his name. Names in that valley were complicated. He let her half carry, half drag him to the spare bedroom above the tack room. She set him on the mattress, felt the way he flinched at her touch, then breathed less like someone surrendering and more like someone who had figured out a shape to fit around this responsibility. Her hands moved with the competence of someone who had bathed a colt and stitched a horse's leg after a wire fence let go. She cleaned the wound with whiskey and water because it was the only thing she had on hand that promised cleanliness. Wrapped his side, found morphine and smaller stitches in a doctor's kit she'd kept since Thomas's last fever. He slept and woke with a fever and a hand like a claw, but he did not try to steal anything that night by dawn. He had given her an Elias March hand, a story that was more omission than confession. He'd been in Fort Rourke, he'd said. And then he'd stumbled into trouble that shorted circuit to a warrant, an angry posse, and a bullet that wasn't meant for him. He sketched no politics, but he let the word Rourke fall into the room like a pebble. Name ring a bell? She asked, her heart a stone the size of herself. It did. Silas Rourke's ledger had a way of touching people in the valley, and Lyddie felt the old ledger's scratch in her throat. Sheltering a fugitive was not small-town gossip. It might mean the newspaper came. It might mean posse men and cartwheels of trouble aimed at the property she had left. Yet the man in her bed looked less like a threat than a mirror of what had happened to Herringerd. Hunted, carved by someone else's hand. He was dangerous and necessary at the same time. When she folded his coat and kept watch while he slept, she understood the choice she was making. It was not the first time Lyddie had chosen exile over surrender. She would make the call quiet, strategic, called with her eyes for the land and the animals before it was made with her mouth. If sheltering a man could be a step toward, a way to hold onto what remained of her land, she would take it. Not because she wanted to save a man, but because she wanted to save what she had earned with muscle and memory. She would follow her hands and let her heart arrange itself after. There was a reason. Silas Rourke's name kept returning to the floor like a coin. Lyddie would not allow another ledger to decide her luck. If a wounded stranger had come to her gate, perhaps the fates were handing her another kind of ledger, one where she could write back. Elias March woke with a tenderness in his side and a conscience he didn't expect to need. He had been an outlaw, sometimes by necessity and sometimes by design. But he'd never been a leech tasted on the kindness of a woman who could set a broken stirrup and mend a mare's torn flank. Lyddie moved about the property as if the land itself answered to her glance. He watched her hands, the slow confidence with which she fed the mares, the way she spoke softly to a foal that had come late at night. She was not a woman who would be cowed by words or by brandished authority. She was a force refined by loss. "We ought not to have sheltered you," she said over coffee boiling, black, a bitterness that cut through his fog. "But I have neither the stomach nor time to hand strangers to men who do law as they do business." Lisa's laugh came dry. "Thank you, Miss Hale. I won't forget it." "Don't call me Miss. Call me Lyddie." It was a small correction, but it was a boundary. She owned it. He respected it. That exchanged two names, two measures, was the first rope between them, taut but ungiven. They moved like two pieces learning to share a board. Lyddie knew the land where the gullies swallowed wheels, which fence posts were rotten, which gelding took to the tar in the winter. Elias knew other things that were useful in a valley run by paper and gun. How to read the men who ran the county offices by the tilt of their hats and the calluses on their fingers, where a ledger could be slipped and a signature swapped. He had been a runner once for certain men whose morality was the color of their coin. He had also been a marshal in a town with fewer rules than it liked to claim. He had spent time in the shadow world where legalities blurred, skill set that would have made Silas Rourke comfortable. That was precisely why. Lyddie felt the jolt of danger when he offered his help, yet she had never been a woman who accepted help blind. "You know, Rourke," she said, not as accusation, but as question. Elias nodded. "I know men who make their little kingdom in the ledger. Rourke's king among them. He's got the sheriff in his pocket, or near enough. He sells claims, moves witnesses, and he likes to keep people unsettled, keeps the prices low." Lyddie listened, and like she did with a mare's ear twitch, took in the subtlest signals. His hands trembled sometimes when he spoke about the men he'd been with. His face tightened when he told the story without finishing it. He had secrets that bent toward violence, but he had never put a finger to a trigger while on her land. On Lyddie's watch, he did work that meant they could both survive. He mended fences, brought in forage, and watched the mares when she had to go into town. She, in turn, used his knowledge to shadow the men who came to town in suits and smelling of new paper. Together, they built a kind of double ledger, one of horse bloodlines and incoming sales. The other a map of the men who had taken too much. They were not companions, yet there was a wary distance, a measured politeness that saved both from the rawness of need. But the valley is small, and information travels on the wind. Within a week, men came with questions. A stagecoach had been held up 3 days back, and blame was being cast around like a tossed hat. The man who claimed to be pursued for violence had wound up bullet-ridden outside Lyddie's gate. People in town whispered, what business would an outlaw have at Lyddie Hale's? Lyddie answered with numbers. I've a mare for sale, a stud coming in, and I don't take livestock from thieves. If you want to trade, you will trade honest. Her firmness unsettled the gossips. Women like Ruth the midwife listened at the hardware door and then shut it so she could set down her tools and offer a hand. Old May Combs, who had a voice like gravel and a sharp punchline, showed up with 2 jars of lard and the knowledge that Lyddie had always paid her debts, never owing anyone more than she had to. Women brought bread, mended her shirts, and provided companionship that had nothing to do with asking questions. There was a network sewn tight by years of reliance, women who traded favors and used eyes to tell a neighbor when danger might come. We look after one another, Ruth said plainly. You've always done the same. That solidarity was the leverage Lyddie had been missing. The men on the county board had underestimated the alliance of women who kept each other fed and sheltered, who had learned to stand shoulder to shoulder when the law became a blunt instrument rather than a shield. Lyddie began to realize that sheltering Elias could be a means not to condone every choice he'd made, but to let 2 kinds of knowledge meet, her terrain and his tactics. It was not a surrender, it was a strategy. They tested each other's limits in small things. Elias once found a ledger of his own old receipts Thomas had kept tucked behind a loose board in the barn. He was surprised at the neatness of the accounting, at how Lyddie had balanced feed costs and full expectedness with an iron patience. You kept this, he said, admiration softening the hard lines of his face. He didn't know how to hear admiration without the fear of owning someone with it. I did, Lyddie replied. We kept everything we needed to know. Money comes and goes. Knowledge stays. He watched her work on a mare that had a foal's hip out of joint, and saw no feminine smallness in how she set bone and skin and calmed the mother. The same hands that could swaddle a foal could also load a rifle properly. The same woman who could knit could also stand, jaw set. When the sheriff came by and asked questions about a man named Elias March, the sheriff did come. He came with a manly swagger and a note from the land office. He asked flat questions about the wounded man, about whether property rights had been violated, whether a fugitive had been harbored. Lyddie answered with a ledger of her own, receipts, buyers, names, dates and accounting that had nothing to hide because she hid nothing. When the sheriff frowned at the neatness of it all and threatened the law, Elias stepped in with a repost that was more bluff than proof, and the sheriff's swagger flickered. That evening, as they sat by the stove with a skillet of onions between them, she told him plainly, if you stay, you work. If you wouldn't come to terms with that, you'll ride until someone else finds you. He met the terms. He worked with the discipline of someone trying to make amends, not to erase the past, but to be useful in the present. That usefulness became their currency. The sheriff retreated for now. The land office's writs were still a dark cloud, but the ground beneath Lyddie's feet felt less alone. She had added an ally whose skill set matched her own stubbornness. He had added a home to the only place he could think of that might keep him alive. Winter light fell in long slices on the barn, painting hay and hoof in the same amber. Lyddie had spent 3 cold months tending to Elias's recovery, tending foals through their first tremulous days, and counting the days until spring, when mares came into season and money might be made again. That winter did something that the previous years had not. It pulled Lyddie away from being only a woman who suffered and toward being a woman who could implement change. She had ideas, and the valley, out of habit or necessity, began to listen. The safe haven she built was not a fortress of stone, but a circle of behavior, women who vouched for one another, men who preferred buying horses from a reliable hand rather than speculators, and a small market in town that resented the land office's overreach. It was, in the very practical sense, a business plan. Lyddie set it like fence posts. She kept her breeding records up to date. She improved the soil with crop rotation. And she used Elias's healing touch. He could splint a leg in a way that made a horse comfortable to send. Stronger animals to market. For the first time since Thomas died, the numbers on her ledgers straightened into a promising arc. Elias, for his part, watched Lyddie with a growing respect that had nothing to do with the usual male admiration. He admired the economy of her movements, the way she negotiated prices without needing to snap. She had a plan to improve the mare lines by a particular stallion from over the ridge. A stallion whose owner would never have sold to a woman alone. Lyddie planned to buy him and sought Elias's opinion. He told her what he thought, that she should do it boldly and publicly to stake her claim in front of the town. Let them see you by what you want, he said. Don't make it secret or shameful. So she did. They rode into town with a buckskin saddle and a determination, and she negotiated with an ease that surprised the broker. She paid with money saved and some credit from May Combs, who still insisted she be repaid in labor rather than coin. The town watched Lyddie buy the stallion and led him home like a living declaration. It wasn't just the purchase. It was the fact that she'd been brave enough to expand while the land office's shadow still crept. She was staking a future. At night, Lyddie would stand near the hearth and think through details that most people found small but which stacked into security. How to fence the lower pasture against rains that transported cattle to the creek, which old heshed beams needed replacing before spring thaw. Whether Ruth could be paid with feed to help Lena across town when the winter cough came. Her mind kept working in the language of preservation and growth, where others saw only survival. She saw the possibility of building a model of independence that might not require permission from a corrupt office. Elias watched this metamorphosis with the wariness of a man who had long been in the habit of challenging his own loyalties. He found himself more than once a week, taking notes on what she did and making suggestions in the same tone he'd used countermanding. Bad calls in a shootout, a practical kind of respect. He loved that she asked him for an opinion and then made the choice she wanted anyway. You're not all talk, she told him once, dry as the barn air. You take a stand. Make yourself useful and I'll keep you alive. He laughed, and the sound that came back didn't belong to a man who had been broken beyond repair. They'd built a routine where both were agents in their own stories. It was in that steady labor that Lyddie began to heal. She recognized small triumphs. The foal with the crooked front leg that, under her care, learned to run straight. The draft mare that pulled a plow smoother than a man half her age. The buyers who came back for a second horse because the foals she raised were trustworthy investments. Her hands, once rough from burying, now had the softer calluses of someone who had found satisfaction in the right kind of work. And there's a particular kind of healing that comes when competence grows into authority. She began to run training sessions for women who wanted to better understand horse care. Ruth brought in 2 young widows and an older woman who had never let a mare have her way. Lyddie taught them how to catch a foal that fought, how to feed a mare in milk, how to check a hoof for an abscess. The women listened, asked pointed questions, and then practiced on Lyddie's patience. The barn became a classroom. They exchanged stories. They healed together. This was the moment Elias realized his place had shifted. He had not simply been sheltered. He had been part of a movement that gave women tools that even the land office could not take away without drawing attention. He watched as Lyddie stood in the haylight and instructed, and men came through the barn doors not to judge but to learn. She commanded authority without raising her voice. People responded. Yet amid the healing, Lyddie never softened on the matter of justice. She had nights where the ledger that had once been used against her haunted her. Thomas's signature seemed to whisper in. She would boil coffee and map out wrongs like a war tactic. She had a mind for justice that was as meticulous as she was with breeding pedigrees. She knew why a man like Silas Rourke had been able to build power. The county's mechanisms were designed to favor those who could wield paper as weapons. She also knew she had an advantage. She didn't have to prove her worth to men who'd already decided she'd lost. She only needed to reestablish value where people measured it in horses, in livelihoods. In the quiet aesthetic of a barn full of healthy foals, she slept better. For the first time in years, there was laughter in the kitchen that wasn't jagged with loss. Elias woke to the sound of women exchanging recipes and stubborn jokes. They traded stories about stealing apples in their youth and about moments when they refused to be quiet. The safe haven was a place where Lyddie could rediscover that resilience was a muscle. She exercised it daily by saying no when she meant no, by calling out a man who lied to her face, and by returning to the ledger with the steady hand of someone who builds rather than breaks. Her shadow, though, remained. The land office's writs were not gone. They lurked like a storm. But storms can be weathered, and Lyddie was learning not just how to stand in the storm, but how to direct where it would fall, with Elias tending horses and Lyddie tending her heart and business. The ranch that remained to her began to feel unmistakably like her own. Elias March carried his past like a scar that taught him cold lessons. He had moved through towns like a shadow, known men who traded in papers and gunpowder, and had kept his mouth shut about it until the night he realized Silas Rourke had threaded his corruption through people he'd once counted as friends. It was the kind of knowledge that could not be easily pigeonholed into a confession. It was messy, stinking, difficult to use. Lyddie, pragmatic and often lyrically direct in her speech, didn't ask for toys of his past. She wanted tools. "So, what's your past worth?" she asked one late afternoon as they mended a fence with a barbed wire taste on their tongues. "Because you can tell stories or you can show me where Rourke's ledger lives." Elias's jaw clenched. The sun cut a strip of light across the pasture, and he saw, clearly, the thing he'd been avoiding saying aloud. He had been a courier for men who liked to move papers at night. Deeds, receipts, names inked into boxes. He had once delivered a bundle of papers that resulted in a family losing their farm. He'd looked at the faces of the family the morning after and had found that what he'd done could not be undone. He'd stopped taking certain kinds of jobs, but some of what he'd done left tracks. "Rourke's got a habit," Elias said slowly. "He keeps copies in a place he thinks safe to storage up by the second ridge, under the third slat in a shed that used to be a mailroom. He thinks no one knows about it. He leaves signatures there when he wants to make a quiet change. They keep more than deeds in there. He uses that shed for his favors." The name Rourke still tasted of rust in Lyddie's mouth. A storage shed with slats small, precise, easily overlooked. It was the exact sort of place where evidence could be kept and staged. A little dirty nest for ill-made documents. If Elias's memory was right, and he had risks in memory that came from the nights. He'd run with men who didn't keep time then. There was an opportunity. Evidence was currency, no corrupt ledger wanted in public. Elias did not want to be the man who fixed Lyddie through dirty techniques. He wanted to be the man who proved he could be useful without violating the new moral code he was trying to live by. So he offered what he could. He would help her get the papers and expose the forgeries. But only if she agreed to lead the case publicly, to be the face of it. He wanted no part in legal triumph. He could not stand beside this suited Lyddie. If there was going to be justice, she wanted to be the one to take it. She had the knowledge and the right to the piece of ground they'd once tried to take from her. He had the knowledge to locate the ill-kept room where lies were stacked on shelves. It was not a rescue. It was a partnership. They planned, like farmers plan for drought, meticulous, slow, and thinking several steps ahead. He would scout the shed and tell Lyddie the pattern of guards. She would prepare witnesses, women from the town who had been cheated, farmers whose deeds had been moved. They would gather the evidence and then take it to the county recorder with a force that could not be shrugged off as rumor. Lyddie knew that publicizing the corruption would be risky. People who relied on Silas might turn on them. The sheriff might stage a raid. Men with business stakes could come with guns. but not acting was worse. She had been broken once by silence and would not let silence be the tool again, as they set their plan in motion. Elias's outlaw skills became tools that served her cause rather than his survival. He taught her how to read ledgers for hidden marks, to spot a signature that had been traced. She learned how to recognize acronyms, small initials that told of a man who owed a favor, and how to place witnesses where their testimony could not be bought cheaply. They devised methods of acquiring copies, not theft but careful documentation, taking photographs where possible, or making transcriptions, smuggled by trusted women who ran errands between towns. He watched her moral calculations. What was worth risking and what was not? Then why she often chose the side of action. She was not motivated by vengeance, but by a belief in economies of fairness. If the land was to be held lawfully, then the law must be fair. Elias admired that. Where he'd been previously driven by a survivalist code, he now found a moral clarity in following Lyddie's lead. Her framework became the compass for his restlessness at the same time. Lyddie watched his redemption arc with the sort of skepticism that had kept her safe. Before, she did not allow romantic sentiment to cloud her judgment. She kept him busy with chores, with fence work, with the nitty-gritty of keeping horses alive through mud. When he came to her with a new idea, one that involved getting into a storage shed under cover of darkness, she listened to the specifics, asked the hard questions, and then made decisions that cost sleep but promised leverage. Through Elias, a part of Silas's world became visible to Lyddie. Through her, a part of Elias's past learned restraint. He would not have imagined himself willingly learning to make feed or to catalog mares. And she would not have imagined needing the kind of cunning he possessed to by time. The balance between them was a constant negotiation. He learned patience. She learned the value of a well-placed bluff. Their interactions developed an intimacy of respect. It wasn't the sudden fire of passion that novels caricatured. It was a slow, deliberate knowledge of how to stand beside someone in the muck and not flinch. When he steadied her at the fence post and she steadied his hand as he wrapped a spring, the touches were practical and meaningful. Both felt magnetized to a partnership born of necessity and refined into mutual admiration. Danger, of course, smelled the way trouble always does, like metal and dried sweat. Silas Rourke was not unaware of the threat of exposure. He tightened his ring of influence, moving men he trusted into positions and cutting deals that rustled in back rooms. The more Lyddie and Elias marshaled witnesses, the louder the agent talked. He called his men to town with a sort of casual menace that made people step aside. Lyddie felt the weight of that pressure, not as terror but as reason. They had evidence. They had allies. They had each other. Whatever you do, Elias told her the night they made a copy of an altered deed. Do it your way. I'll do mine. We'll meet the middle. She looked at him then, the firelight throwing shadows across his cheekbones. You can do other things besides obey men for coin, she said softly. You can be useful in a different way. He smiled, not a soft smile, but one worn like a shield, and, in that moment, the real work began. Not a change of hearts, but a redirection of skills. His history, once a liability, became a set of keys. Her clarity of purpose turned those keys in locks she had previously thought jammed forever. There is a hollow place that corruption carves into a life. And Lyddie had lived in it long enough to name the edges. She had been robbed of land, not by weather or chance, but by the deliberate hand of men who had learned how to use law as a blade. She had been humiliated in town meetings, lied about in print, and asked to bear the reputation of being difficult when, in truth, she'd only refused to accept paperwork that had blood on it. The county recorder's office had been a place where signatures were swapped like poker chips, and the sheriff had worn his hat at the same tilt as men who accepted envelopes on courthouse steps. Lyddie had tried to fight it the only way she knew, through persistence. She showed up for hearings. She studied legal texts with the stubbornness of a woman who had always made do. She collected statements and tried to trace the signatures that had stolen a portion of her family's homestead. When it didn't work, there was a cold legal shrug. The law for the powerful had loopholes sewn into its hems. For the powerless, The same law was a rope. She had lost Thomas in a grief that was a slow, gnawing hunger. He had broken the last of his patience on the steps of a courthouse he could not sway. His last word to her had been practical and raw. Keep what you can. That what you can had become everything. She could not move on until she set the ledger right. It would not be enough to buy a stallion or to train foals until the town told a kinder tale. She wanted to take back not just land, but dignity. There were nights when she dreamed of the county recorder's office, of the smell of ink, and of Silas Rourke painting his smile on top of theft. Those dreams hardened resolve into a plan. She convened the women in the barn Ruth May Combs, Lena, who had lost her brother to a deal that had been called unfortunate, and a cluster of younger women who had been shushed by parents who feared speaking out. Lyddie laid the ledger related to her case on the table and walked them through the facts in a voice that made the numbers matter. This is where he pushed through a false deed, she said, laying her finger on the lines. This is where signatures were traced to make it appear Thomas gave up the land. Ruth's voice, low and untroubled, lined up behind Lyddie. We may be small, she said, but we're not stupid. We know when a man does wrong. We're a web. He'll think us a few flies. He won't suspect a whole net. It was more than bravado. Women in that valley had learned the power of small visibility. They could not easily be marched into courtrooms and shouted down because they practiced influence in ways corrupt men had underestimated. They were the ones who cooked breakfast for men who might later be called as witness. They were the ones who could get a servant to overhear a conversation. They were, importantly, organized. Lyddie's plan was not merely to ambush Silas with stolen papers. She wanted to expose the network, the sheriff who took favors and then looked away, the broker who falsified receipts in exchange for a cut of the land, the men who played musical chairs with titles. She wanted to do it in a way that would not offer the county the alibi of an old grudge. She required a chain of custody that could not be brushed off as rumor. She needed corroboration. Elias's knowledge of the shed and its slats gave them the initial foothold. They checked the ledger's contents against the county's records, found discrepancies, and noted the initials Silas used when he wanted a document to be ready for midnight changeover. They located witnesses who could testify to patterns of bribery and coercion. But Lyddie knew the real power would be in posture. The delivery? She had to go to the county recorder and lay the case out such that the public could see the face of corruption and the sheriff could not tangle it into a muddled argument. On the night she stole sleep to assemble testimony, she recognized that this fight would cost more than just her. People she called friends might be called enemies by association. Elias, who had life experience in the shadows, was readying himself for consequences. He did not try to talk her out of it. He positioned himself at the edges, ready to fetch what she needed, but refusing to be the face of the case. She had to be. The thing about justice, Lyddie told Elias as they sealed the evidence in a box, is that it isn't pretty. It's messy. But if you craft it with care, it becomes unshakable. I want to be the one who holds the hammer this time. Elias listened. And in the listening, he saw that the fight inside her was not personal animus, but an insistence that law be law. He had been running for reasons of his own. But once he'd seen what Silas had done to families, including Lyddie's, he felt the tilt of his moral scale begin to lurch. He could have stayed on the sidelines forever, pliable and profitable. Instead, he chose the side that let him sleep at night. They called witnesses in careful order. Men who might have feared Silas's retribution were guaranteed protection by a network of women who vouchsafed each other's presence. Lyddie used the fact that women in town were both overlooked and literate. Their testimony would not be instantly discounted if presented in numbers. They gathered statements, wrote them in a language of integrity, and took the case to a lawyer who had a reputation for not being bought. His name was Harlan, and he had a way of looking over a stack of papers and saying the words, "A case needed." "You're going to have to want this," Harlan told her when he saw the box of evidence. "You have to want it in the way that yields you to a trial. The county won't let it die quietly." Lyddie met his gaze and felt the old ache that had kept her silent for too long. "I want to want it," she said. And I want to do it on my terms, with witnesses who have the courage to speak." Harlan nodded. He would do what lawyers do: prepare an airtight accusation, present the chain of custody, and, most crucially, make sure the judge could not sweep the matter under a rug. Lyddie left his office with the kind of resolve that stiffens a spine. She had turned personal loss into preparation. She had recruited allies who would speak. She had, crucially, decided to be the woman who would hold the hammer. There is a moral weight that comes with choosing a battle. Lyddie understood the stakes. She also knew that there would be no peace unless the Ledger's Clause were pried away. She had seen what silence did. It allowed men like Rourke to multiply. She would not be that woman. She would be the one who forced the Ledger into daylight, even if it cost her friends or the easy comforts of a life under the radar. The stage was set. The evidence was gathered. Her fight would be measured not by the volume of her rage, but by the precision of her actions. For the first time since Thomas's death, Lyddie was not merely surviving. She was preparing to demand justice. A plan is only as good as the people who execute it. And Lyddie's plan had an execution team that surprised even herself. Elias's outcast skills and her community's determination formed an alliance that, for once, felt balanced, not the kind of classic rescue narrative where a man swoops down and the woman thanks him. Rather, it was a collaborative dance where they learned each other's steps until both could move in concert. They rehearsed the logistics like farmers rehearsing a harvest. Elias would retrieve a copy of Rourke's altered deeds from the shed by night. Lyddie would then present the copy in public, backed by testimonies and the corroborative notes of the women who had witnessed the corruption. But there were details they couldn't ignore. The sheriff was close to Rourke. The recorder, who had a reputation for looking the other way, could be swayed only by a public pressure he couldn't afford to ignore. Lyddie needed to make the case impossible to dismiss. "Public matters operate on momentum," Elias said as they spread a map across the kitchen table. He pointed to the route from the shed to the recorder's office and to the various places men stopped for coffee. "You get it out at the right moment, make a bit of noise, and the sheriff either has to act in good faith or he looks guilty." "Or both," Lyddie replied. "I want the sheriff to have to choose." Their planning sessions were less about theatrical gestures and more about specifics, timing, who carried evidence where witnesses needed to be sheltered, and how to prevent someone from cashing a threat before it mattered. Lyddie taught Elias the finer points of who in town kept which grudges and how money flowed through church, bake sales, and cattle auctions. He taught her how to read men's leisure, where they hid receipts, and how to stage a trespass in a way that would make a forged deed stand out. Both were learning the other's trade. Romance threaded through these sessions like a quiet seam. It did not start with stolen kisses, but with the small things. Elias handing her a tool she reached for without looking. Lyddie listening as he described a tactic and then adding an improvement that saved time. They argued on purpose about the best time to present evidence. Not because they couldn't agree, but because the friction brought better choices. He didn't command. She didn't defer. They bickered and collaborated in equal measure. One evening, while the women of the valley stitched witness statements by the lamplight, Lyddie paused and said something that surprised even her. "You don't have to prove yourself to me," she said, cleaning a pen with deliberate motions. "But if you're going to stay, you must understand what staying looks like." Elias looked at her steadily. He'd seen men like him take refuge and then get swallowed by old habits. He'd seen women like Lyddie choose partners who made them smaller. He wanted to be in the precise, non-flaming way she needed him, the kind of partner who didn't eclipse her. "I don't want to be your shadow," he replied. "I want to be your anchor. I know my sins, Lyddie. I'm trying to do right." That exchange, small as it was, laid a cornerstone. They were learning to be equal in public planning and private life. He taught her how to read the sheriff's mood by his boot polish. She taught him how to bake bread without burning it. Little things made them human to each other. Bigger things made them formidable together. When the day came to put their plan into motion, they executed it like two halves of the same mind. Elias slipped into the shed at dusk and moved with the quiet-footed precision of a man who'd spent nights avoiding notice. He returned with a folder wrapped in oilcloth and the exact documents they'd hoped for: altered deeds, stamped receipts with names that didn't match signatures, a note from the sheriff's office that hinted at a profit-sharing arrangement. The proof was ugly but real. Lyddie, meanwhile, had lined up the witnesses. Ruth, May Combs, and several farmers agreed to stand with her, each ready to tell a version of a coordinated injustice. Harlan, their lawyer, had prepared court documents and a press release that would ensure the local paper couldn't ignore the story. They would take the evidence, lay it on the recorder's desk in front of a clerk who would be forced into a public moment, and then release it into the town square. When they arrived at the recorder's office, they moved as equals. Elias stayed by the entry, his presence a quiet wall that the sheriff could not easily dismiss. While Lyddie walked in with the documents and the women behind her, the recorder's clerk paled when he saw the ink and the detail. The sheriff's stooped posture spoke of a man whose comfortable path had been interrupted. "I have the right to petition," Lyddie said, and her voice was level, an instrument tuned to unshakable note. "I have the right and I intend to use it." The sheriff tried old maneuvers: laughter, unnecessary questions, a suggestion that they discuss the matter in private, but the presence of the women and the clear chain of evidence made that impossible. Lyddie's strategy wasn't to humiliate the sheriff, but to remove his ability to humbug the process. When the county paper printed the list of altered deeds and signatures, the sheriff's indifference became a public spectacle. Through it all, Elias stayed in the background, playing a role that was crucial yet unflashy. He escorted witnesses, kept an eye on patrol routes, and made sure that any attempt to remove evidence failed. He did not stand beside Lyddie in the headlines. He stood behind the scenes in the ways that mattered. It was as if he'd learned where to place his strength, no longer in deception, but in stewardship. That night, when the town had read the ledger and turned its opinion, Lyddie and Elias sat on the porch with a pot of stew warming between them. Neither spoke poetry. Neither needed to. Their eyes, their patience, the quiet interlocking of hands were the texture of something deeper than rescue. They had both given and received in equal parts. She had given him a reason to try. He had given her the skills to strike back with real evidence. Behind them, the women who had stood with Lyddie gathered on the fence line, trading small smiles and sharing the satisfaction of having done something right. "We needed someone to start," May Combs said. "You did the starting, Lyddie." "No," Lyddie replied, looking at Elias and then at the women. "We did." Hope can feel like a delicate thing, and in Lyddie's world, it came with a cost. The county paper had splashed their evidence across the front page, and the town was abuzz. Some called Lyddie brave, others called her reckless. But the legal machinery was now rotating in a way that couldn't be wholly controlled by a single man with a ledger. Silas Rourke, predictably, reacted with the arrogance of someone who'd long assumed his empire was untouchable. He sent threats. He dispatched men who made a habit of convincing witnesses to recant. The sheriff, whose face had once been a lazy map of compromises, found himself on display, his loyalties examined under a light he could not quickly move. In the crest of these events, Lyddie was forced to make a choice. The county's case could proceed slowly, and perhaps the law would do its work. But Silas had men who could make life difficult in other ways. He had already begun buying land around her, making offers with the air of a man with infinite cool. If he could isolate her physically, if the pressure on sellers and buyers was increased, he could strangle her business by interfering with her market, with the quiet cruelty of withholding trust. On the other hand, Lyddie could choose to up the stakes, publicly humiliate Silas by pressing criminal charges, by insisting on a jury, by calling for investigations into the sheriff's office. That would be dangerous. Men who had everything to lose rarely folded quietly. Or she could step back, sell the stallion, take the money, and walk away from a fight she had waged with careful strategy, but that might end in violence. She considered the possibility of safety. It would be simple, measured, and likely to buy the peace she needed. Elias, ever cautious to preserve what they built, said what a man who knew the price of trouble would say: "You can take the safe road. Live to fight another day." But Lyddie had built momentum with witnesses, with women who had told truth even when they were scared, with buyers who had begun to know the name of her bloodlines. She'd made choices that had given people faith in her. Stepping away now would feel like a betrayal of those who had risked their words and reputations for the sake of justice. It would mean that the Ledger's corruption continued to win. She could not reconcile that with the face of Thomas's last smile, or with the women who had gathered at her barn and put their names to sworn statements. She stood on the back porch one night, the valley a muted breath below, and thought of a future that wasn't determined by other people's petty rules. In some earlier life, she might have decided to sell and move east where no one knew her name. In this life, she had invested her dignity in the form of a horse and a herd and a community. What she chose now would determine not only her business, but the moral climate of the valley. "Do you want to hand that ledger back to him?" Elias asked softly. It was not a plea. It was a test. He would not pretend he knew what the right answer was. "No," Lyddie said, the word like a hammer. "But I also won't pick needless bloodshed. That's not my style." The choice she made was the one that balanced courage and calculation. She decided to press the case publicly, but in the most strategic legal manner she could. Demand an official investigation that the state authorities could not easily ignore. Arrange for a neutral venue for hearings. Make sure a juror would understand the language of land and ledger. She refused to be the woman who went to war because she was broken. But she accepted being the woman who asked for accountability because she cared about future farmers who might be cheated. She would not pick violence. She would draw the battle in the frame of law. That was both radical and frightening. Elias, who had been used to making choices that saved his skin the quickest, found himself agreeing with the calculus. They would press for the state's oversight by a lawyer who could speak to corruption and call the witnesses in a way that minimized exposure. He would handle the outside trouble, the threats, the men who might show up with guns. She would handle the court face in a rare, tender moment when she considered the life that might unfold if they won. Lyddie allowed herself a brief indulgence of imagination. She saw a ranch that was no longer hounded by writs, a stable that thrummed with the sound of foals, and a kitchen where laughter had more space than grief. She saw Elias not as a man to be repaired, but as a partner she might choose to have. Her imagined future was pragmatic and intimate. He did not complete her. He made her whole as a collaborator makes a house solid. The calm before the storm came as a brief afternoon when they sat on the fence and smoked. Pipes or didn't. When they let conversation drift to small things, favorite cooking spices, the way horses like to rub their heads together. They spoke of a life built on mutual respect. Not a man claiming a woman. Not a woman leaning on a man, but two people making a living together with shared decisions. It was gentle, and for a few hours the entire valley seemed to hold its breath. The danger, of course, was gathering. Men at the county office were alarmed. Silas was not a man to give up without a fight. He began to rustle old friends and show his teeth in ways that made neighbors nervous. The sheriff's loyalty was tested, and old alliances creaked like fence wire under strain. They had chosen the legal rubric for their battle, but law is not always a straight road. Corrupt men know how to bend it. Still, Lyddie had made her choice. She would not pick the path of quiet safety. She would take the harder, riskier path because it meant something. It meant refusing to let a ledger write off the futures of women and men who depended on honesty. She realized her decision carried more than the hope of a win. It carried the hope of example. She would be the woman who chose accountability, and she would do so with her eyes open. Once a choice is made, consequences come like stormwater down a gully fast, inevitable, sometimes destructive. Silas Rourke did not respond to Lyddie's careful legal request with silence. He retaliated in ways that used what he'd always used: money, influence, and the willingness to make life hard enough that people would capitulate. He started small to test the resolve in the valley. He called in favors, bought grain at predatory rates, and handed out loans to men who'd been wavering. The sheriff, who had been skittish during the initial press, shifted back and forth like a weather vane. Some of his deputies were men who had benefited from Silas's largesse. The first real danger came in the form of a notice, an injunction aimed at Lyddie's buyers, making them unsure about the legality of purchasing horses from her property. If the buyers froze, her business would be strangled. Lyddie breathed through it, as she had taught her students to breathe through a difficult birth. You don't panic, you prepare. She had choices, but they were fraught. Fight back open-handedly and risk escalation, or pick smaller, crafty moves to keep her business afloat while the legal work went on. She chose the latter, invoking the network she'd built. The women in town came through, buying feed and exchanging testimony publicly to keep the market alive. They made purchases and traded receipts, ensuring that the flow of commerce didn't stop at her gate. Silas then tightened his grip. He had a way of making people's jobs harder. Shipments delayed, auctioneers warned, leases threatened. He also, in a move that stung Lyddie personally, sent men to the ridge where her best mares grazed at night. There were lights and loud voices and the thunder of boots. The mares were spooked and a foal was heard in the scramble. Lyddie found a trampled hoof and the deep red bruise of someone making a show of force. This was not about law anymore. It was about breaking spirits. Elias, who had been a man practiced in the art of watching danger come like an arrow, met the men at the ridge under the shadow of the moon. He argued quietly, and then, when arguments failed, moved with a force that was more than a show. He did not, however, rise to Silas's level of violence. He protected the herd, guided the mares to safer ground, and in the morning Lyddie found him with a hand wrapped around a splintered limb, jaw clenched after having done what was necessary. She looked at him and felt a swell of gratitude that was also complicated. He had defended her property not by dominating her, but by following the plan they'd set together. He protected, he did not dictate. Silas's next move was more barbed. He manufactured a new claimant, a man from the other side of town with papers that suggested Lyddie had agreed to a sale that would forfeit a parcel of land she still occupied. The courtroom, which had once been an instrument for the powerful, became a theater for old alliances. Men who feared Silas's reach whispered of the consequences of backing Lyddie. The sheriff's office called in a detective from the next county, a subtle attempt to give the impression of objectivity while preserving the old power structures under pressure. Some witnesses faltered. Old loyalties, threats, and the promise of financial reprieve from Silas caused tremors within their ranks. It is one thing to gather courage in private and another to stand against a man who can sear your business with a ledger. Lyddie understood the weight of that choice. She also knew that a single faltering neighbor could mean the difference between success and ruin. She did not permit despair. Instead, she rallied women who had been on the fence, reminding them of what was at stake. She called an emergency meeting at the barn and laid out a new, more urgent plan. Keep the animals safe, keep the buyers moving, and fortify the testimonies with public statements and affidavits. Ruth, with her steady hands, organized the women into teams to visit hesitant witnesses. May Combs used her gossip as a weapon, telling loud stories in the saloon about what it meant to let a man like Rourke stand unchallenged. People began to see that the threat was broader than any single farm. Meanwhile, Elias hunted the edges of Silas's operation, trying to identify who in the chain of favors could be pried loose. He tracked a money trail to a man whom Silas had bought out of debt and persuaded him to talk by offering an alternative: safety, a fresh start, and the knowledge that his word could build a future rather than burn it. Those bargains were not cheap. And Elias often returned from a meeting with bruises on his hands or a far-off look in his eyes. He had done some things before that required a kind of penance that had no easy ledger. As Silas escalated by threatening the sheriff with exposure if he didn't turn the screws, Lyddie prepared for the worst. She had set contingency plans in place, documents duplicated and hidden in more than one place, witnesses rehearsed for cross-examination, and arrangements with a printer in the next county to ensure the evidence couldn't be silenced with a single subpoena. She also cultivated a physical defense: women who could ride, who could handle horses, and who weren't afraid to stand in lines and shout until the world paid attention. The image of a band of women on horses in a valley known for men's bravado began to circulate through town and unsettled those who had relied on tongue and ledger. Silas, seeing his influence threatened, played a hand that almost brought ruin. He threatened Lyddie directly in a public setting. At a town meeting, he dressed his threats in legal jargon, insinuated that the troubles at her farm were a sign of mismanagement, and suggested quietly that anyone who did business with her did so at risk. The sheriff did nothing to interrupt. The whisper that followed was immediate. It would have been easier to crumble. It would have been easier to sell the stallion and sign a quiet agreement and move away. But when Lyddie looked out at the women who had prepared the barn for a possible defense, at Elias, who had refused to take the easy escape, she saw something larger than herself. She saw a community that had chosen dignity over bargain. She realized the fight had become about more than land or sorrow. It had become about teaching the valley that a ledger could not be allowed to decide who lived and who lost. The forces manufactured by Silas had conspired to make them shrink. Lyddie refused. With Elias at her side in the practical ways they had worked, with women at the barn ready to ride, she prepared to stand. She would not be a passive target of a corrupted system. She would be the storm that forced it into daylight. Nothing prepares you for the hour when your world narrows to a single, sharp pivot. For Lyddie, that hour came in the coldest night of spring. A fire began near her lower pasture. Someone had struck a match in the dry brush and the wind. A traitor had turned a small flame into appetite. They had saved most of the herd by moving them quickly. The men and women of the town had rallied like they'd never rallied before. Horses snorting and saddles creaking as they pushed beasts to safety. They had barely contained the blaze when a second calamity struck. Silas, in a bold and vicious move, had forged documents that allowed deputies to seize certain assets tied to the disputed land. He claimed that a temporary seizure was necessary pending court review. The sheriff, cowed or compromised, issued the writ. That night, a wagon rolled up to the barn, and men in blue reached for the stud and the mattress that held Elias's clothing, for the best harness, for anything transportable and valuable. The men moved with legal authority and the kind of certainty only power can produce. Lyddie ran like a woman who had been taught fire drills in a lifetime of small disasters. She argued at the top of her voice, enumerating titles, receipts, and evidence until she breathed past the edges of hysteria. Men said curtly that if the county issued the writ, she had no immediate recourse. Elias tried to stand in the way, but was jerked back by a deputy with hands that had a suspicious comfort with force. One of the deputies shoved a woman May Combs back hard enough to send her stumbling into the mud. Lyddie saw the spark of rage and fear that has no neat category and felt it flood her limbs. They took a trailer full of hay that, by the paperwork now in someone's pocket, belonged to a man in town who had been told politely to relinquish goods in hopes of staying out of trouble. They dragged away the stud she'd purchased only 3 months prior, the stallion she'd hoped would rebuild her breeding lines. Lyddie fought in a manner that wasn't dramatic but was fierce. She grabbed the reins thrown on the trailer, tried to stop it with her body, and in the scuffle felt a sharp shove that threw her to the ground. She came up with gravel in her palm and a hollowness in her bones she couldn't place. Everything she'd hoarded, every scrap of dignity, felt like it was being loaded onto a wagon and taken to men's pockets. She looked at Elias, who had blood on his lip from a blow he'd taken while shielding a witness, and then at the sky where the smoke had begun to curl. The law, once again, wore the face of betrayal. This was the valley at its most cruel. Lyddie had expected threats, stratagems, even slights. She had not expected the comfortable willingness of the state to weaponize its authority for a man who could afford to bribe the scale. She had not expected the sheriff to choose convenience over courage. She had not expected friends to falter when the deputy with the badge threatened. Consequences? Her darkest hour was not the moment she thought of as personal ruin. It was the moment she saw the faces of the women who had come to help Ruth with her steady jaw. May Combs wiping the smudge of smoke from her cheek, and saw fear in their eyes that matched her own. Lyddie understood then that it wasn't only a personal bankruptcy, It was the risk that the town's impulse to bow would grow stronger if she caved. Elias, bruised and stubborn, caught her arm. "We can fight this," he said, voice like gravel, but with a determination that had not quite burned out. "We'll take it higher. We can take it to the state. They'll have to answer." Lyddie looked at the torn harness on the ground, at the empty place where the stallion had been, and felt a rupture that made all her calculations flare. She recognized that the law could help, but only if the spotlight was bright enough. She had prepared for public exposure, but nothing had prepared them for official seizure. She had a lawyer, Harlan. But even Harlan's jaw had tightened at the audacity of a deputy. Obeying paper that didn't match reality. The town had fractured in a way that cut deep. Some men muttered sympathy, but were too frightened to act. Others openly sided with Silas, citing order and quick resolution. The sheriff's deputies, emboldened by a man who controlled their benefits and promotions, had no immediate conscience. Lyddie felt the world narrow to a point where it could have broken her, but she did not break. That is the thing about the darkest hour. Either cleaves you or it shapes you. Lyddie shaped herself. She called Elias and Rufus, a farmer who had always owed her favors, and then called Ruth to organize a roster of women who would not let the moment be co-opted. They would not chase the men with guns. Lyddie had no illusions about the violence that likely would ensue. They would gather testimonies, call the press, and bring to light the seizure that had been falsely justified. She wrote a letter with shaky hands to the state attorney, detailing the night's events, listing the men involved, and including names of witnesses ready to swear to the forgeries. Harlan took the letter and, with the quiet ferocity of a man who'd never been bought, prepared to take it to the next level. Elias, wounded but unbowed, went to town and bargained with a man who'd been on the edges of Silas's ring. He bought his silence in exchange for a life away from the county. It cost Elias more than coin. The struggle that night left Lyddie drained physically and emotionally battered. She had, in that night, lost material things, but had gained a clarity that no man could confiscate, the willingness to use every lawful weapon available, even if the process would be bitter. When she finally went to bed with mud still on her boots, Elias by her side, she felt the weight of the fight settle into her bones like an expectation. They had fallen badly, but they had not erased the ledger yet. And the fact that they still drew breath was proof enough that they had more to do. People in the valley spoke of Lyddie's stubbornness as if it were a trait passed down like a stubborn gene. In truth, it was cultivated, a day-by-day practice. After the seizure, after the smoke and the hollowing of the pasture, she rose like steel worked slowly into shape. Her plan had shifted from measured legal process to a hybrid of law, strategy, and moral mobilization. If Silas used every corrupt instrument he had, then the valley's rebuttal would have to be louder, more organized, and insistently public. They began by turning a corner where silence had previously lived. Harlan, the lawyer, took the letter Lyddie had written and filed an emergency petition for an injunction against Silas's actions. He insisted on a hearing at a neutral location, one that could not be easily intimidated. In tandem, Lyddie organized a parade of witnesses, farmers, women who had been cheated, buyers who had been threatened, all to be present when the county judge read the facts. She used the same straightforward honesty she applied to breeding to make her case. Evidence. Witness, rule. Elias, whose life had been one of on-the-run tactics, evolved into a strategist, a man who now used his old skills to build new tools. He found men Silas had used and quietly offered them an alternative. Speak and be given protection, or remain complicit and risk exposure. He also orchestrated small acts of economic insulation. He secured private buyers in another county for those whose purchases were being threatened by Silas's propaganda. The ranch that had been cut from the valley's flow began to find channels of trade that bypassed the big men. Perhaps the most striking development was the way women rallied to Lyddie's cause. They formed a deputized vigil of sorts, not to wield weapons, but to watch and testify. On the day of the hearing, they filled the neutral hall. Ruth stood with her spine straight. May Combs sat with a look that would have made a man think twice about handing over a false testimony. Lena, who had lost a brother to a shady deal, prepared herself to speak truthfully in the face of the powerful. The hearing opened and a hush fell over the room. The judge listened not with the languor of a man used to theatrics, but with an attention that had once been the ideal of the law. Lyddie presented her testimony with the same exactness she used in the barn. Dates, signatures, chain of custody, witnesses. Harlan presented the forgeries. Elias brought in men who could identify Rourke's handwriting quirks. They spoke of midnight exchanges and backroom deals. Silas attempted to flail. He sent lawyers and produced his own witnesses who leaned on the old narratives of economic necessity. But the court was stacked with clear documentation. The man who had relied on the elasticity of his power found himself suddenly constrained by a network that refused to be cowed at one crucial moment. A young farmer who had been paid by Silas to sign a paper under duress stood up and, with his voice breaking, told the court the truth about the money he'd been offered. The testimony was small but seismic. It broke the rhythm of denial. The judge, whose face had been carefully neutral, watched the ledger unfold like a map in which Silas's lines led to a dead -N outside. Men from the valley watched. They had lost respect for silence. The parade of witnesses, mostly women, forced the town to see the breadth of the corruption. Editors who'd once been bought had editors' consciences to answer. The story spread beyond the county like a brush fire of indignation. The judge's ruling, when it came, did not simply favor Lyddie. It removed key deeds from Silas's influence, mandated restitution where possible, and ordered an investigation into the sheriff's office. Silas's power was reduced in degrees rather than entirely dismantled, but it was enough. Lyddie had not wanted to gut the man. She had wanted to reclaim what was hers and set a precedent that others could follow in the aftermath. Lyddie chose a renewal instead of revenge. She negotiated a settlement that allowed her to reclaim the pasture, and sought out a buyer for the stallion the county had seized until she could bring him home legally. Elias, who'd once been a nomad of choices made for survival, found a way to stay that was not a tether but a tethered freedom. He admitted quietly that he'd been wronged by his past. He apologized to Lyddie not as a supplicant but as a man accepting responsibility. "You're not my savior," Lyddie told him one evening as they walked the refurbished fence lines. "You never needed to be. You never needed me," he replied. "But you chose to let me stay." They were equals in the way that matters. Responsibilities shared, decisions made together. Their romance did not erupt like wildfire. It smoldered like a hearth, warmed by two people who could feed the flames. They kissed on the porch in a way that was both careful and earnestly. Hungry two adults who'd found solace in partnership. Other women in the valley found the courage to rebuild. The women who had testified at the hearing returned to their work with a new sense of purpose. They kept watch on legal things and organized cooperatives to ensure buyers weren't extorted. The barn became an institution of sorts, a place where women could trade knowledge and where independence was taught and passed on. Lyddie's ranch flourished. She secured fair buyers for the foals, reconnected with a network that respected her name, and bid to buy back the stallion's services with an arrangement that favored her. And the stallion's owner, it turned out he had grown tired of negotiating with men who bought and sold like gods. Elias helped reconfigure the market. He was no longer a man on the run. He was a man who had found a place where his skills did not shackle him but helped build something honest. Her appearance changed subtly. She kept her hair tied back most days but allowed it to fall in the evenings. Her clothes, once patched and practical, began to look as if she had chosen them for utility rather than necessity. Her face carried less of the hollow of grief and more of the plain hardness of someone who'd made her life and would not yield it. This was not the ending of conflict. There would be setbacks, legal appeals, and the occasional threat. But Lyddie had learned a different posture: to stand, to press, to make sure that the law could be a shield. Not a weapon the corrupt wielded. In the valley, songs began to circulate about the woman who had stood up to a land agent and made her own luck. Lyddie preferred the quiet facts to the legend. But she did not deny the way her example inspired other women to demand fairness. The court's decision had been a decisive blow to Silas Rourke's operations. But the final act of triumph required more than a judge's gavelet, required a community to stand and maintain that victory. Lyddie and Elias understood this implicitly. They took the court victory as a legal cornerstone on which to build a more durable structure, one that could withstand Silas's last desperate attempts to claw back his influence. Silas, meanwhile, was both disgraced and dangerous. He had been reduced in the public eye, but he still had contacts and bitterness. Rather than sparking rage in Lyddie, his persistence sharpened her resolve to make the valley more resilient. She wanted to make it structurally difficult for anyone to wield power through forged papers again. To that end, she spearheaded a project to create a local registry, a community-run ledger verified by witnesses who had nothing to do with county favor. It was an audacious plan, a registry of land claims and sales, overseen by a rotating committee of townsfolk and women who would hold one another accountable. The project brought women into formal positions of responsibility for the first time in that valley's memory. Ruth, with pride born of temperament and skill, volunteered to be on the oversight committee. May Combs, who loved a good fight, handled the administrative headaches. The registry became a place where women learned to keep legal documents and to cross-verify signatures. It was a lesson in taking power away from single men who abused it and placing it in the hands of many, while civil reform unfolded. The legal system also did its work. The state's investigation into the sheriff's office led to the indictment of a few deputies who had accepted bribes. The cost to Silas financially and reputationally grew. He attempted to make a last grab, threatening a behind-closed-doors deal that asked Lyddie to accept partial restitution for the sake of peace. She refused. Peace bought with silence is not peace, she told him calmly. It's permission. Her resolve became contagious. Buyers who had once feared Silas began openly doing business with her. They understood the economy had changed and that an honest transaction was now an asset itself. The ranch's foals sold for fair prices, and the stallion returned to offer services under a contract that made Lyddie a partner rather than a client. She negotiated the contract herself and signed it in the presence of her committee. Her signature now had a different weight, less the mark of a vulnerable widow and more the seal of a respected businesswoman. Elias played a crucial role in ensuring that those men who had been complicit in small ways were given a chance to make amends. He brokered deals where restitution was feasible and where men undertook labor rather than facing ruin. It was redemption for him to see people repair harm without simply being crushed by it. He had achieved a second kind of victory, redemption through action. In that, his arc paralleled Lyddie's. Both had moved from being defined by past sins and losses to being architects of future fairness. The final confrontation came when Silas attempted to set the sheriff against Lyddie's community by accusing them of harassment, trying to frame their vigilance as a mob. It was a last gasp, a gambit to intimidate and return to power. Lyddie refused to be baited. She had arranged for neutral observers and lawyers to document every meeting, every action. When the sheriff's accusation was brought before the court, it was quickly revealed as manipulative. The judge's patience for such theatrics had run thin. The public would not easily allow a return to the old ways in the courtroom. Lyddie stood, no longer trembling, no longer a woman whose voice got lost in the shuffle. She spoke plainly about the men who had been hurt, the families who'd lost their land because of forged records, and the responsibility of the state to protect people against those who profited from corruption. Her words were not rhetorical flourishes, but steady, practiced testimony. She outlined not only the harms but the remedies she proposed: a registry, oversight, and community education about property rights. The judge's ruling finally sealed the matter in practice. Silas was ordered to restitute as possible and was barred from handling county property transactions in the foreseeable future. The sheriff faced internal reforms. The registry Lyddie had helped create was recognized as a community safeguard. It was not a fairy tale finale. There were no bankruptcies and no banishments. But there was justice that functioned and changed the rules of the valley in the aftermath. Lyddie returned to her ranch and found her life taking on a rhythm that honored both business and love. She and Elias reconnected with a future they could choose every morning. She had regained property, and with it, a new kind of independence. Financial stability rooted in her skills and reputation. She no longer had to fear strangers at the door offering deals that would lead to another theft. The foals grew into steady mounts, and buyers came not out of pity, but for good stock, and the romantic life that had grown between. Lyddie and Elias was rich because it had the soil of equality. He loved her because she was capable, fierce, and unafraid. She loved him because, despite a past, he had come to respect her choices and had worked to make amends. They faced each other's flaws, forgave where it was right, and held each other accountable when needed. There was laughter around the table and shared tasks at dawn. The valley, once dulled by the shadow of a man like Silas, began to buzz with a new sort of pride. Women took on roles in local councils, in the registry, and as spokespeople. The barn became a sanctuary and a civic center, a place where births of foals and births of policy were both celebrated. The community had learned that when a woman led with intelligence and support, change could be practical and durable. As for Silas, he learned the price of overreach. He was not annihilated. Human systems rarely make that tidy a correction, but his voice was diminished. The ledger he once used as a weapon had been exposed, and the town would remember. Lyddie stood on her porch one evening with Elias beside her, watching the horses graze in the golden light. She felt the worn edges of her grief, but also the smoothness of a life she'd fought for and built. She had become a leader not by wanting to, but because necessity had made it right. She had found love not as the capstone of her story, but as a companion to it. Time moves like a horse steady, and unhurried when a life steadies into a new normal. A year after the hearing, Lyddie rose before dawn in a home that held Thomas's memory, but no longer wore the shape of loss. The barn stables had been repainted under a cope fund established by the registry. The pasture gates were sturdier, and the mares were sounder. Money was no longer a desperate flume, but a ledger of predictable wins and careful investments. Lyddie, at 39, moved through the ranch with a calm that came from earned competence. The registry she had helped create had become a legacy accurate, community-run, and respected. People no longer defaulted to the county in the way they once had. They took their recordings to a place where women sat on the oversight committee and where signatures were verified by neighbors who would be ruined if deceit took root again. The valley's economy regained a fairness that made honest labor profitable. Lyddie traded in foals with a reputation that spread beyond their small county. Buyers came willingly and paid fairly. Elias had taken up residence, not as a man hiding from his past, but as a partner in a life clearly chosen. He lived in a small house close to the barn, his tools stacked neatly, his hands skilled both at mending tack and at folding feed sacks for distribution. He had found ways to channel his knowledge into protective services for the community, working with the new county attorney to help vet suspicious transfers, assisting with security for transport of high-value stock, and occasionally teaching young men and women how to read the signs of legal trickery. He did so not to redeem himself theatrically, but to make tangible repairs. Their relationship settled into a steady partnership. They held planning meetings over coffee over the fence. During milking, that felt like two professionals arranging a practical future. They debated purchases and shared holidays with a tenderness grounded in respect. Lyddie still had moments when grief arrived in, the scent that reminded her of Thomas, or a dream that left her with a sudden ache, but it no longer dictated her life. She had made choices for her present and her future. She had stopped waiting to be saved. Women from the valley visited her barn for workshops that taught not just horse care, but boundary politics, how to read deeds, how to file a complaint, how to form a registry. Lyddie was often asked to speak at gatherings about what had been required to stand up to corruption. She did not enjoy speaking in public, but she realized the power of her voice. She spoke plainly. You keep ledgers and you keep faith. You do not let a man use the law as a club. She taught those women practical things, the difference between various breeds for particular trades. how to pick a good gelding for plowing, and how to band together financially to make a purchase that would otherwise be out of reach. The barn became an educational center in the way that a kitchen table becomes a place of diplomacy. People came to argue and left with new tools. Financial independence came in measured ways. Lyddie bought back portions of land when they became available, negotiated fair agreements, and made a small but steady profit from the horses she bred. She used profits to create a fund for the registry and to support other women who needed legal help. Where the valley had once been a place where women started with little, it slowly became one where women held assets and taught each other how to protect them. Elias and Betty also practiced tenderness in the ordinary. They shared a garden where they grew herbs and vegetables for their table. They taught each other recipes. They took long rides without purpose. They danced once at a small-town gathering, laughing at the awkwardness of two adults who'd never been taught to dance properly. It was, in all ways, a mature romance, a mutual choice. Not a rescue, until the distance. Silas Rourke's name became a cautionary tale rather than a looming threat. He still influenced some men, but fewer and fewer. The registry had built a buffer around the vulnerable. Lyddie and the other women had created a system of shared information and trust that was hard to corrupt. Where once a ledger could be used to take a life, now a ledger was used to protect it. The environment of the ranch itself reflected Lyddie's transformation. Where she used to wear threadbare coats stitched with memory, she now had a patch of clothes that were durable and chosen for their usefulness. A scarf of Thomas's lay tucked into a drawer, not because she could not let go, but because memory sometimes demanded a ritual. Her hands still bore the faint scars of grief, but they were also softened by the pleasure of creation. She taught a child in town to stuff a hay bale properly and not to be intimidated by men who assumed youth meant inexperience. She advised a neighbor on how to set up a small feed distribution co-op. She continued to cultivate female alliances, recognizing that collective power was the best defense against private tyranny. On a late summer afternoon, when the sun slanted long and gold across the pasture, Lyddie stood with Elias and watched a mare deliver a foal. The birth was quick and precise, the foal's legs finding the ground in a rhythm that made both of them laugh. It felt like a metaphor. New life, new arrangements, and the tangible proof that careful stewardship yields fruit. She thought of Thomas with a soft, unburdened kindness. She did not forget. She had integrated the grief into a life that was forward-facing. She had chosen love again, and this time it had neither the urgency of rescue nor the pressure of being the solution. It was a companionable love that honored independence, which she kept like a talisman, both practical and sacred. The story ends here, but not in the sense of a fixed endpoint. Lyddie had transitioned from being a woman defined by loss to being a woman who defined her own fate. Her choices had reshaped the valley. Women who heard the tale of the horse-breeding widow, who sheltered a wounded fugitive and together outmaneuvered a corrupt land agent, carried the lesson forward. Power shared is power that lasts. And so her story ends where yours continues. She was told she was broken, but she proved them wrong. She was left for dead by a system that valued men's signatures over women's labors. But she rose stronger. She was meant to be silent, hushed by threats and bad ink. But she chose to speak and to organize. If you're a woman who's been knocked down but refused to stay down, if you believe it's never too late to reclaim what's yours, your business, your dignity, your joy, then you've found your tribe here. Share this story with a woman who needs to remember her own power. Like this tale, if you believe the strongest love is built between equals who lift each other up. Subscribe to hear more legends of women who refused to be victims, who turned pain into power, and who wrote their own endings. Hit the bell, sister. These stories are not just entertainment, they are proof that you are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and deserving of a love that sees you as the hero you truly are.